So in today's video, I have several ideas for the negative, and then at the end, I have a couple of directions that you might want to think in picking a really strategic affirmative. In the video that I did previously on the team policy topic, I talked about a strategy where you would define environmental policy as that which falls within the purview of the Environmental Protection Agency, and then some disadvantages that could go with it. EPA trade-off, funding trade-off, human resources personnel trade-off, but also the regulatory agency politics disadvantage. So I've already posted a few cards on the vlog that you could use for the topicality argument, but when it comes to finding the cards for the disadvantage, the regulatory politics disadvantage, here's the direction I think you ought to go. What I did back when I put this disadvantage together, the search term that I used was regulatory reform. Now, the political landscape was pretty different back then. This was only a few years after Newt Gingrich had taken control of the House and the Senate for the Republican Party with a contract with America. And one of the big parts of the contract with America was regulatory reform, that they were going to cut back on frivolous and unnecessary regulations that federal agencies were coming up with. And really, the situation is very different now. Because of the financial crisis, there are more people who are saying that deregulation may actually have gone too far. So when you go digging around to see what you find as far as regulatory reform, you might find that what's being written now is not quite, the political environment is not as charged. It's not the case that when regulatory agencies issue a new regulation or make a sharp departure from the past, that they stir up as much political trouble. But one thing, because of the nature of this topic, because it is bidirectional, that doing something can be topical and doing the opposite of it could also be equally topical, you're going to need to write all of your disadvantages to go both ways. So I've talked before about the EPA funding trade-off argument. You're also going to want to have an argument that saving money in the EPA budget is a bad thing. That they have a program that they try to do, but it's kept cut to the bone because it's underfunded. And if it had more money, that's where they'd put their money because that's one of their highest priorities. And it's a really, really bad idea. Maybe a burdensome regulation on industry that would do bad things to business confidence. Because unfortunately, because of the way the topic is worded, it's going to be almost completely unpredictable what people actually do. So if you show up with a bunch of disadvantages that say having EPA do more is going to take away their money and take away their personnel and stir up political trouble, and then you find that what the affirmative is doing is devolving the EPA, taking things away from the EPA, cutting down on the EPA's burden, you want to be able to go that direction as well. So if you look for regulatory reform, I did a little bit of looking and I found that there are a couple of books in the last couple of years and a fair number of scholarly journal articles and political science journals. So if you've got a good, well-equipped library somewhere near you, this, I think, is a direction you might want to go. I know that we were really surprised how good the internal link cards were before, and even though the political environment is a lot different, I still think that there's promise that you could find something that you could tie to action in this area, especially if you could lock the affirmative in with that topicality argument. Let me talk a little bit about what you do with arguments like these and what their purpose is in the season. Now, if anyone has been watching these videos and thinking, well, that's a pretty lame strategy to be using in any big stakes debates, what you do with this is what we used to call the generic negative strategy, and you don't rely on it all year. You rely on it at the very beginning of the year when you're still finding out what's out there, when you're still making your lists and setting your priorities for where do you need to do case-specific research. Those first couple of tournaments when you're not sure what you're going to hear. You also keep the generic negative strategy around because later on in the year, if you debate a very good team and they know you're a very good team, they may pop out something new on you. And the generic negative strategy is at least something you can fall back on if you don't have a case hit at all. So, if it seems as though the topicality argument is not something that's going to bowl people over like a wrecking ball, well, it's meant to serve a purpose. And if you dig in your heels and really are prepared to defend the argument, I think it has a lot of potential. I think it's an argument that has some appeal. The evidence, you're not going to win the evidence war on environmental policy, meaning what the EPA does, but you can win that that's a reasonable limit around the topic that gives the affirmative plenty of things to say, but otherwise draws a line around a topic that's completely out of control. And then if you've got these links to these arguments, you're in business, and you can debate people on them. One other tip for something I think you ought to be looking out for on the negative, and then I'll talk a little bit about the affirmative. I ran across a book the other day. The book is by an author named Eric M. Potashnick. And the book is entitled Reforms at Risk, What Happens After Major Policy Changes Are Enacted. It's a 2008 book, and I think you're going to find a whole lot in it that is awfully good. I think you'll find some political disadvantage links. There is a chapter on environmental policy. There is a chapter early on defining what they mean by reform, and there's at least one extremely good negative topicality argument saying for something to be a reform means that it is not incremental. It is not a little piecemeal change. It's something that changes the way the game is played. So you really want to, if possible, track down that book, because I think it's got some stuff in it that you're going to find useful all year long. Now let me talk a little bit about some directions on the affirmative, and then I want to talk just a little bit about what I'm going to do in future videos on this vlog. The advice I can offer you is from the end of the year, and I'm going to talk to you about two of the new affirmatives that we took with us to nationals, because I think they provide you with a little bit of a model that you might want to look into for some very strategic affirmatives that it would be hard for the negative to get a toehold against. The affirmative that the team I was coaching ran in the final round of the national debate tournament, what they did is they retrofitted all federal buildings with solar panels. And the advantage was that would put solar in enough buildings all across the country that it would get solar the market share that it finally needed, and then the cost of solar would come down and more businesses would adopt solar as well. And they claimed big global warming, and they were prepared to claim a number of other things, but it was a pretty tricky affirmative to try to get a disadvantage link to. They opted out. They had a pretty easy time with the states and federalism debate. Why is it the states' turf to decide what the power system is in federal buildings? As far as political disadvantages or any kind of perception disadvantage, this was the federal government doing some house cleaning on its own buildings, so it was very much internal. I mean, how often do you hear about changes in policy that the federal government passes that affect only federal workplaces? So this was something that it was actually very tricky to debate. Our opponents, Wake Forest, actually went for topicality against it, and because they had misunderstood the topicality violation in the 2AC, we lost on topicality. But for a lot of the other arguments that we were worried about hearing, it was strategically very sound. Now, what you could do, I do not know the state of putting solar in federal buildings. I know there's some demonstration projects. It would not surprise me at all if the Obama administration has somewhere on one of its back burners that it wants to go ahead with this. But that's something I would check into if I were you, and it need not necessarily be solar panels. There are any number of environmental reforms that you could adopt only for federal ground and for federal workplaces, and in that way take away a lot of the disadvantage links that the negative may be kind of salivating over. The one other affirmative we took to nationals, and we used this one, I think we used it in a prelim round, and it came off very well. It was very effective. There was an interstate compact, and I want to say it was between Georgia and Florida and possibly Alabama over the Chattahoochee River. And that interstate compact had gotten completely dysfunctional, and the officials in the different states were just bickering with one another, withholding information. And so what the plan did is it had the federal government take over from the interstate compact. And it was a very tricky affirmative to try to debate, because what were you going to do? Were you going to run the state's counterplan? Well, the whole 1AC was why the states were doing a bad job of this. That the states already had been involved in it, and their efforts were just a complete meltdown, and were actually giving cooperative federalism a bad name. And as far as disadvantage links, the federal involvement did not actually change what the plan did, or didn't change what the cleanup method was. It just changed the coordination of it. So it seems to me what you could do today is you could do a little research and try to find out what programs, conflicts are going on between states over environmental measures, and see, is there one where there's good solvency evidence that the federal government ought to be involved in this? And then you have an affirmative that doesn't give the negative very much ground as far as new spending, as far as political perception, or anything else that the negative is going to be able to fall back on as far as generic negative strategies. One last thing I want to say, and then I'm going to bring this video to a close. I have a few more topics that I can make videos about. I have some pieces for interpretation, oral interpretation, that I'm sitting on for this year, and I have some tips for skill building for various areas of the activity, for policy, Lincoln Douglas, limited prep, all of those. But really what I want to do is I want to give you the opportunity to send me an email with questions that you've got, and to make video updates when I have a bunch of questions to answer. So, if there's anything that you would like to hear me talk about and develop an answer to, the address that you should send those to is dr.srader, Dr. Schrader, @gmail.com. And I will be keeping my eye out for those, and if I get a good response, then we will have some vlog posts here in which I will take on whatever it is that you have been wondering about or whatever you've been up against and been struggling with, and we will see what we can do to get you more competitive and some more wins.